1. Background. I had a pretty terrible childhood. Don't get me wrong, I've heard of way worse, but it was far from healthy or normal. When I was young, my parents were millionaires, my father's parents owning several of the largest businesses in the region. They divorced before I was a teenager, and both of their lives plummeted downhill. By the time I was 16, I was living on my own. Drugs, alcohol, and addiction have long since killed them both. Neither of them have ever worked a job since I was a teenager. Both of them died homeless before the age of 50. Situation. I joined the military and left town without ever looking back. As more years passed, I added more and more distance physically and mentally from my parents. When I was 20, I learned my mother had been arrested for stealing a large sum of money from my grandmother, who was living on her own but in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. The state ended up pressing charges against my mother because my grandmother would not. The detective told me that they had to, because my mom and her piece-of-shit boyfriend were fueling the criminal underground where she lived. I was lost and shocked. I knew my mother had problems, but until this moment, I had always viewed her as a sort of forest hippie. This is the moment that is the catalyst for my nuclear revenge. You see, my grandmother was pretty wealthy. Terrified that she would be locked away in an old folks' home, she entertained the leeching of my mother and this POS guy. The problem is that it was never enough. Even after my grandmother bought my mother a house down the street from her, she continued to rob her own mother blind. She also fed my underage sister a stream of drugs and brought her in on the con. It ultimately resulted in my mother and sister getting their first felony conviction: grand theft and check fraud, which my mother tried to pin on her own daughter because she was just a minor. A few years later, I was newly married with my first child, and freshly returned from my first deployment to Iraq. We just completed another move across country, and I'm starting a new job at a new unit. I get home from work and have a strange short voicemail from my uncle, who is like the okayest guy I've ever met. It literally just says, "My mom is in the psych ward at the big hospital in her town. She left everything in your name. I'm flying back home." This is where I learned that the legal document my grandma had me sign when I was 16 made me the executor of her estate, power of attorney, etc. My unit arranges a very generous amount of time off to fly across country and deal with this bizarre scenario. She lived alone in this massive house. My mom had destroyed the house my grandmother bought her, then moved into grandma's house on the auspices of caring for her. There were so many fleas inside that contractors I hired to make repairs wouldn't go inside, needles everywhere, and for some reason everything was an ashtray. It was an insane thing to witness and experience. I still refused to interact with my mom at this point in my life, but now that I had the keys to the kingdom, aka access to the pot of gold, she tried to worm her way back into my life with renewed vigor. I always just told her to fuck off. My grandmother, in the meantime, had been deemed unfit to live on her own. I was 23, with a new baby and marriage, if you remember, so I made the poor decision to put my grandmother into a nursing home. I fixed up the house, rented it to create passive income so she would not deplete her savings, and headed back home. Of course, Grandma is spicy and got kicked out of her swanky retirement home when she broke a coffee cup over some other lady's head for snooping around in her room. She was apparently wearing my grandmother's shoes when she got clocked. The same woman, a resident, had propositioned me in front of my wife when we were touring the facility. She was a different kind of the same spicy as Grandma. Her only option after the incident was a psych ward, so my senile grandmother moved in with my family, and she lived with us for more than 5 years until care was just out of our capability. This is about the time that I exacted my revenge. The nuclear option. When the state filed charges against my mother way back when I was 20, part of her restitution included a lien that was placed against her property in the name of my grandmother for a little less than $100,000. Some years later, my mother had not paid her property taxes in so long that she was about to lose the house. She called me to explain that the lien would not be paid if the house was auctioned, which I knew was not true, but I saw an opportunity. I eventually worked out a deal with her. She would sign the deed over to me, and I would then sell the house and pay for her to move somewhere else. I fly to town, meet her, and sign the deed over. She expected me to use my name and credit to get her a luxury apartment. She also wanted me to buy her a new truck, and let's not forget the moving company. I rented her a U-Haul truck and got her a storage unit that I had paid for 6 months. Then I put her and her shithead up in an extended stay for a little while. I fixed up the property and sold it to the same rental group that bought my grandmother's house shortly before. I used the money to buy annuities that enable my grandmother to live in a normal house with a live-in nurse and care at 1:4 ratio, which is amazing for her. She still might run out of money because of what my mother did, and I honestly don't know what will happen then. She's got some years before I have to worry, and she is just shy of 100. My mother was on the street within 6 months. The last time I saw her, she looked like the crazy person who lives under a bridge. She did, at one point. She was covered in sores, balding, and methed out. She had received a Social Security disability back payment of what would have been a significant amount for her. She died in hospital less than 3 days later, partied herself to death. The piece of shit dropped her off at the curb and never saw her again. I told the dude I would give him some money if he gave me the key to the storage unit. Somehow, years later, she had managed to keep it. I shared the loot with my siblings, gave him $100 and closed that chapter of my life permanently. I've now been married for more than a decade, with 2 awesome daughters. I won the wife lottery for sure. Her family is like the antithesis of mine. 2. When I was in college, circa 2014, I had a neighbor in an apartment complex that was a total Karen, who everyone hated. She was so rude and condescending to literally everyone else, had an annoying-ass dog that yapped all hours of the night, and hated students with a passion. She regularly filed noise complaints against people, again mostly students, who were literally just living their lives. She would also file complaints with the college. The final straw was when she called the cops on me and my roommate when we were hosting a board game night on a Friday at our apartment with a few friends. We had no music on and 0 alcohol was involved. But Karen had called them and told them that we were having a big wild party. The cops showed up and of course nothing happened to us, but we got a written warning from management because cops were called out to our apartment. Karen happened to have a wireless printer. I knew this because it showed up in my computer whenever I connected to Wi-Fi. Now, Karen was also one of those tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists. This set up the perfect storm. My roommate was from Belarus, so obviously she was fluent in Russian. I also speak multiple languages and was learning Russian at the time. I'm still learning it because I love the language, but goddamn, it is difficult. Obviously, I speak much better now, but even back then, I could piece decent sentences together if I went slowly and tried hard enough. We started creating these letters from Russian government officials and printing them out on her wireless printer. We actually searched up official Russian government correspondence and copy-pasted the headers onto Word documents, and then just wrote vaguely threatening bullshit. Most of them were along the lines of, "We are watching you. We know what you did on such and such a date. You think you're safe, but you're not. You'll never find the bugs we put in your house," stuff like that. We slowly progressed into more outlandish stuff. One memorable one we did was instructing her to take the documents we sent to her printer, it was a letter and a bunch of sheets of binary code, and deliver it to random map coordinates somewhere in our city. We would do this not only when she annoyed us or one of our neighbors, but at completely random times throughout the day. She was confused at first, but then I guess she managed to use the Google Translate or something to figure out what the letters said and would freak out. We would split our sides laughing whenever we heard her hyperventilating through the wall. We just kept bombarding her with these letters, and after a few months of this, her reactions turned into horrified silence whenever her printer was spit out another letter. We could hear her phone conversations, and she legitimately thought she was being watched by Russian spies. She actually called the cops once, and they were like, "You're being threatened by the Russian government?" Yeah, right. She eventually ended up moving. which I'm not going to say was 100% because of the letters, but it may or may not have been a contributing factor. It was glorious, and we still joke about it to this day. 3. Quite some time ago, I started as a first-year teacher. Anyone who is a teacher can tell you the first few years are especially rough. But it's even worse when your administration is completely toxic. What's worse is this was a charter school, so there were less protections for teachers and a lot of shady practices. Initially, my biggest issue was this dick of an assistant principal who from day one decided she didn't like me and had it out for me. She would try to write me up for anything she could. She never had an observation, she just made up her evaluations of my classes. She made my first year hell. Now initially I thought the problem was entirely her, but then I met my two favorite people. I was placed with a new team for my second year, and it was through them that I learned that it wasn't just this ass of an AP who was toxic. The whole administration was bad-mouthing me, and made my new team think I was a complete train wreck. I was nowhere near anything great, but they made it sound like I was completely incompetent and just let the kids run amok. They clued me into all the bad-mouthing they'd been doing, and now I had a better understanding of what I was dealing with. I got through the second year slightly better, but admin decided to place me on probation for the next year. Their evidence as to why was the 4 observations that were being made through the year. I only had one observation ever, and you could see she messed up because that observation was marked extremely high. The others had to be ranked so low that they could put me on probation. The reason for this was they wouldn't have to give me a raise for that next year. They had the numbers just below what qualifies for a raise, but high enough to not have to fire me. I was done, and so was my new team. We had learned that the year before I started there, several of my students had been allowed to cheat on the state testing, and admin had pushed many teachers to help kids on the test. Someone in my team tipped off a few parents, which caused them to pull their kids from the school, and I think one of them tipped off the district. Sadly, nothing came from that. Yet, at least. So I talked to them and several others, and we spent the last few days of school applying to every position we could find, just to leave this place. Almost all of us found new positions, and several of the school's best middle school teachers left. Several months later, I heard from one of my friends who was still there. She was a lead teacher and couldn't get close to her salary anywhere else. She mentioned that the ass AP was continuing to badmouth me and saying I'd be fired by the end of the first quarter. It pissed me off, but it solidified my desire to do well and push myself. Then it happened. Thanks to the extra scrutiny from the tip-off, the school was audited an extra time for their paperwork for the ESC kids with special needs. The school had been so horribly out of compliance they were facing serious consequences, but they managed to arrange it behind the scenes so that if something like this happened, blame would fall entirely on the ass AP. To avoid more serious consequences, the school immediately fired her. What's really petty is I'm still teaching and doing well, and from the random check-ins using the internet, she has never been able to get a position at a school. 4. I'm a 35-year-old male from the UK. My first summer between leaving high school and starting college, 6th form, at 16, I got my first job working weekends at my local branded corner shop. It was a minute's walk from home, and pretty easy evening shifts on Saturday and Sunday. Plus, I would pick up any extra shifts from other staff whenever they asked due to holidays and sickness, etc., for a little bit of extra money. Apart from my job interview, I never saw the manager Felicity on site, except when she came in as a customer. Not a big deal, since Felicity paid into my bank account accurately for the hours I worked, and all my shift changes were dealt with by the assistant manager, who I got along with very well. It's also worth noting I am not a confrontational person in the slightest, or at least I wasn't back then, but fuck Felicity. Not in that way. About 6 months of smooth sailing later, the assistant manager has left to run a new store of the same brand, and a new one is brought on board straight away. Gary is a douche canoe. The first weekend he is with me Saturday, Sunday evenings with zero issues work-wise. I show him what I typically do with restocking and other basic menial work between serving customers. At the close of that first weekend, on the Sunday, I sat with Gary in the office and mentioned that whenever a shift was changed last minute, I would go to the old Gary and the hours and wages would be sorted through them by the time payroll is completed. Immediately, this becomes a problem for him, as all shift changes must be approved by himself or the manager beforehand. I said that's fine, but sometimes I get a call very late at night or very early in the morning to cover someone sick for the open at 5 a.m. So what should I do? His answer, "That's their problem. They shouldn't be sick." Amazing. The toxic attitude isn't the problem, however. It's that this meeting took place on Sunday night after close. Now, as a side note, I play golf, and back then I was pretty decent for a 16-year-old. I had qualified through a local, then regional competition, and was in the final of an amateur tournament to be held at St. Andrews on Saturday and Sunday. This was happening a couple of weeks after the above, and so had booked it off and approved long in advance. It was easily the biggest competition of my golfing career. I had a chance to play at the home of golf on the old course. The next Saturday comes around, having not heard anything further regarding shifts, and upon heading in at my usual time, Gary is there. He doesn't say a word to me in greeting, and barely says a thing to me all shift. This is not an issue to me. I've already clocked him as toxic, and so kept my head down and did my job as usual. At close, he locks up, but stays on premises, which is a little out of the ordinary. But I think nothing of it and head home. The next day's shift is the very same. Hardly a thing is said to me, and at close he again sends me on my way, but stays on site. As far as I'm concerned, it's not my problem. Monday morning, however, it turns out it very much is a problem. As I'm getting ready for college, a knock at my door reveals 4 police officers, and after confirming that I am indeed me, and yes, I worked at that store last night, I am grabbed, placed in handcuffs, and arrested for theft. Off to the nick we go. After a few hours of being booked in, searched, and left in a cell with no answers to any questions of what this theft supposedly is, I finally get asked if I know where Gary is. After mentioning that the last time I saw him was at close of the shop the night before, when he stayed on site, I'm told I was seen on CCTV by Felicity taking money. What happened to be the entire week's cash takings from the office safe, along with Gary and leaving. This ends up being a fairly circular thing, with me stating I was not in the office at any point last night, since I have no need to go in at any point with a manager on shift, and no, I don't know where Gary was, nor do I know how much money has been taken, or that I have taken anything myself. I have access to the office, keypad entry, but no safe key. Only Gary and Felicity had those. For clarification, the safe allowed you to drop money in, but required a key for access. And on the opens, the tills, along with enough money and small change, were left out of the safe for whomever was in. I ended up back in the cell for a time. Once the door reopens in the afternoon, I'm swiftly told that I have been mistakenly identified in the CCTV and released. Inasmuch as there was only one person seen on camera, and it clearly isn't me. They apologize, as they had acted on the information from Felicity that morning before being able to obtain the footage for themselves. At least I got a ride home and a day off, I suppose. By this point, my mom has been informed of what happened and left work herself, and after a polite sit-down with the 2 officers over a cuppa as the story was cleared up, Rita's her 5'2" and size 6 frame looked ready to tear these 6-foot slab vest-wearing officers apart from the ankles up. We are left pretty much laughing in disbelief at the whole situation. By this point, I'm just more relieved than anything. Once the officers have gone, we pretty much follow them out the door and walk straight to the shop, as they informed us Felicity is on site, along with another officer looking through all the CCTV they have of Gary. So we head through to the back, and like I said above, non-confrontational. I was pissed off for certain, but I wasn't in trouble anymore, so why bother getting any angrier? Felicity immediately apologized to me over what happened. I think a little under protest under the eyes of the officer, and maybe my mother standing there with a face like thunder. The apology came in the crappy form of, "Sorry what happened to you, but..." excuse, in that she had the wrong CCTV file loaded up. She then goes out one bit further and states that since they were now down on staff for the weekend, I'd have to have my holiday this coming weekend cancelled. Both me and my mum, also a golfer, laughed out loud, genuinely thinking it was a joke. Nope, dead serious. She comes out with the whole, "Well, you can work it or look for a new job" phrase. I just smiled, thanked her for the opportunity, but that she can fuck right off. I turned around and had to gently shove my growingly apoplectic and lightly frothing at the mouth mother outside. As for the revenge part, it's pretty simple, unfortunately. I got in touch with the area manager after the weekend. I was ready to just leave it, but at my mother's insistence, I was to tell the higher-ups. They heard about what had happened, but had not been told the part of my wrongful arrest and my reason for quitting. After all, I was a part-timer, just a little cog in the industry, and having never worked a shift with Felicity even once, she and I had no working relationship. The area manager actually had the decency of coming to meet me in person a few weeks later at a coffee shop in the city to talk about my experience, and ask if I wanted to take my constructive dismissal to a tribunal. I declined, as I had already got a new job, and jokingly, all I was really worried about at the time was picking up Steel Battalion, which had just released from the game store 2 doors down before they sold out. They laughed, then went on to inform me that after a very short and very easy investigation, had found Felicity had been neglectful in both how she handled the theft and myself, but also that she had put herself down as being on shift every weekend at the same time as me to make up her hours. She was fired immediately and was trying to take it to a tribunal in an attempt to protect herself. I wrote a statement there and then in that coffee shop highlighting all of the above issues. The area manager left to take a phone call and came back with a massive box containing Steel Battalion and its massive hotas. I still think that was a fair exchange and still have the controller. The police updated me that Gary was caught 200 miles away a couple of months later, trying to buy drugs from an undercover. Only a small fraction of the money was recovered, and he was already well known to the police up there. He had only been out of prison for a few weeks before starting at the shop. The staff told me that the company took Felicity to court, and she was ordered to repay the missing amount due to negligence. It's probably worth mentioning that cash was very much the main way of paying back then. I do not know the amount owed, but it was certainly several thousands of pounds. 5. One night I had a knock at my door from the funeral home owners down the street. They told me that they had just bought the property between us and were going to demolish the house to build a parking lot. They said they wanted to build a nice vinyl fence between us and that they would pay for everything. All they needed was for me to sign an agreement saying that it was okay for them to build the fence. The agreement was 3 pages long. I told them that I would be happy to take the agreement and read and sign it tomorrow because it was already 9 p.m. They told me that they couldn't leave the document with me and that I had to sign it right now. I responded that I don't ever sign legal documents without reading them completely and that I don't have time right now to read them, then suggested that they mail me a copy. After this, they got very pushy and told me that I have to sign it and I have to do it right now. At this point, I told them to get off my property and slam my door shut. I did some research, and city code required them to build a very specific type of fence, because we had 2 different zonings of property next to each other. A bit later, they built a foam core concrete fence that was 8 feet tall. It looked good, and to an untrained eye, looked to meet the requirements of city ordinance. At this time, I also received a letter from their lawyer about the old wooden fence that they also left standing was on their side of the property line, and that if I tore it down, repaired it, or did anything else to it, they would take legal action against me. Cue the PettyRevenge. I found a city ordinance that outlaws fence within a fence. It basically says that there is only 1 fence allowed per property line. I took that to the City Planning Commission and forced my neighbor to remove the wooden fence. I refused to allow him or his workers onto my property. After that was completed, I went back to the Planning Commission to demand that the correct fence was built. City ordinance stipulated an 8-foot-tall solid masonry fence and explicitly forbid the use of foam core fencing in this situation. The commission sided with me and made him tear out his brand new fence. After that, he put up a temporary chain-link freestanding fence between our properties. The wind kept blowing it down, so I asked him to take care of it. He told me to figure it out myself. So I welded his rented fence pieces together. They were no longer portable. They stopped blowing down. They were also taking a long time to get the permanent fence in, so I ordered a Borat-style neon green Speedo. You should Google it to really understand. I then wore that during the nights in the summer while I sat at my fire pit. The guests of funerals could clearly see all of me lit up in the twilight. I like to think that this helped motivate them to put in an opaque fence. When he finally put in the correct fence, his workers trampled about 30 feet of my rose bushes and killed them, so I had the planning commission order him to pay me damages for the roses. The workers also broke some of my sprinklers, and I was able to force him to repair those too. To top all of this off, he stained his side of the new fence and left mine with only stain splatters and stain drips. Since I was batting 1,000, I went back to the city ordinances and found one prohibited this exact situation. Back to the commission I went. After more fighting, he had to pay to stain my side of the fence too. It took 5.5 years of petty revenge, but now I have a beautiful tall fence to keep my yard quiet and safe. It added a lot to the value of my property too. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Funeral Home, sign that. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Revenge is Ice Cream, episode 246. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. And now that the video is done, I've done something to earn it, please hit the like button if you liked the video. It's a pet peeve of mine when people do that at the start of the video, also when they're rude about it. So if you'd please do it, I'd appreciate it. Right, I don't think there's any other business today, so let's move right along to Hellfreezer's question of the day. And today's question is, what is the weirdest thing you could make a fence out of that would still qualify as a fence? And I'm thinking those funeral home people could just have built their fence out of caskets. That may not have been in compliance with the city ordinance, or maybe, alright, what if we make a fence out of Jell-O? So it's like Jell-O blocks piled on top of each other, so large like bricks of Jell-O, but the size of actual bricks, piled on top of each other. So it's like a Jell-O fence, or a Jell-O wall. Could you build a Jell-O house? Maybe Ed Sheeran could write a song about it. Anyway, let me know what you think in a comment below. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.